All right, very warm welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining me, for joining Henley, I suppose, on the second of this series of interviews with business leaders who are doing absolutely incredible things. If you haven't been on one of these interviews before, I'll just say up front, obviously it's live, but do participate. This is why we're using Zoom. We've got the chat functionality so you can post questions, you can put it through the Q&A. And if you really want to, just message me on the channel and we can try to draw you up onto the panel so you can ask directly as well. But I suppose before we get into that and start getting the questions, I should do the intro. So let's just crack on with that then. So very warm welcome, Nomsa. It's Nomsa Chabeli, the CEO of SABC. I'm very, very excited to have you on this call today, Nomsa. You've got a remarkable career. You've been in the private sector, you've been in the public sector, you've worked with 2 presidents. You come from a marketing background. And then at some point, you've taken this leap to become the CEO of one of South Africa's most important media organizations, the SABC. So I'm hoping that we can dig into that journey, explore the leadership lessons that you've been able to garner over these last couple of years, and particularly get a more detailed understanding about what it's like to lead in this sea of uncertainty that the SABC is in at the moment. I think it's a really fascinating space. From legislation, from the technological shifts, from the competitors in the market. So I can't think of someone who is better placed to explore what leadership is in times of fear, of uncertainty and doubt in terms of what's happening in the future. So with that, Nomsa, a very warm welcome.
Thank you, Colin. Good afternoon to everyone on the platform with us. I look forward to this conversation, and I'm hoping that I can share my journey and that I can inspire the participants here today.
So why don't we start with that journey, Nomsa? Just give us a little bit of reflection of some of the key moments in your leadership life before you took that decision to join the SABC, because I said in the intro, it's been incredibly varied.
I had a very varied career. I've always been a marketer. I think that's important. I've always been in marketing, been in communications, but I think the difference is that I've straddled both the private and the public sector. Having worked, let's say, for government communications, and then also for Brand South Africa, which is responsible for positioning South Africa as a nation brand. But I've also been in the private sector. I've been in a telco, recently with MTN before I joined SABC. I spent some time at MultiChoice. And before that, I was with actually one of my favorite brands, funny enough, which is SuperSport, before I took over looking after the entire MultiChoice brand. So that's just, shows the breadth in terms of my career. But I think most importantly is just to talk through the highlights of that career. I was the head of marketing for the successful bid for 2010, working with Dr. Denis Jordan, with Dr. Evan Koza, when we bid after the unsuccessful bid for 2006. So I was in that famous room when Sepp Blatter announced South Africa is the winners, with the late President Nelson Mandela in the room. It's one of those moments. If somebody asks most South Africans, where were you when that announcement was made, they know exactly where they were. So I was party to that, and for me, even today, that is literally the highlight of my career. I headed the marketing for the 2003 Cricket World Cup. I think that's what spurred my interest in sport. It was a very successful World Cup, also helped position South Africa as a preferred destination for sports tournaments, which really spoke to then the next role that I took, which is joining, the bidding team. I also at MTN had a very good run. I think MTN is one of the greatest South African brands that have grown to be a global brand. When I always say to people, when I say yellow, what do you think of? And immediately, MTN comes up. But I think one of the most exciting periods for me at MTN was really leading the marketing efforts for our sponsorships of the Springboks, who went on to win 2 World Cups in succession, back to back. It's unheard of. And having been party to that, having believed that the team was capable to pull that off. So it's one of really my key highlights for my career. At a high level. Thanks, Colin.
No, thanks for that intro. And you've mentioned, I'm already jealous. I want to go back in time and get into marketing as well. You've met some incredible people, which must be actually one of the joys of the role. You must have been sitting there at MTN so super happy. What on earth happened roughly a year and a bit ago when someone must have approached you and said, "Would you like to come in and consider the position of CEO at SABC?" Because, well, I'm not going to say any more. What was your thought process on that?
Think when I was approached for this role, I had a mixture of conflicting emotions. It's I was happy at MTN. I must say that. Like I said, I just there was that high of we were about to go into Paris, and really I'd run some very successful campaigns. We were the number one network in the country. The number one telco from a brand equity perspective. So I was in a very, very good space. So when that phone call came, it was very highly unexpected. But I think at the same time, if I look at my career trajectory and I connect the dots, it makes sense to be sitting where I'm sitting today. But I think what's important for me, what was overwhelming about it, was just the sheer weight of the challenges and the difficulties that are facing the SABC, and thinking that, do I really want to be the person who is expected to turn the ship around? To turn around a public institution is a very daunting task. And therefore, it really required for me to dig deep. And I think, in terms of those conflicting emotions, one of the key things was asking myself, what's my purpose, which was very important. What is the desire to succeed that I have? I've always wanted a legacy. I'm really about legacy. And therefore, I really had to dig deep for motivation in terms of why would I take on a role of this magnitude with the challenges that it brought. And I think realistically, Colin, one of the key things, is in my previous roles, even though, marketing is really the face of the organization, one did not really experience the public gaze that tends to come with roles of this nature, especially in a public institution. And therefore, there was that issue of just that fear of failure in a very public space. And I think I remember having this discussion with the chair of the SABC, Mr. Katura Mukumba, and when we were discussing, me joining the SABC, and he was very honest with me. He said, Nomsa, both of us will never be remembered for the achievements that we've had until now, but we will be remembered for what happens to the SABC. So it was just those mixture of emotions. So it was that one point in my career where it wasn't a straightforward decision.
I mean, it must have been very difficult because we have to be honest, when we look at state-owned enterprise across South Africa, people that go into those leadership roles tend to come out the other side damaged, and often
Yeah.
having failed. I mean, to go, what was it that I guess, made you decide that you're willing to take this level of personal brand risk?
So what's interesting, Colin, is one of my colleagues, I was at a Women's Day event, and she spoke about how women tend to get appointed to leadership positions in institutions that are struggling. And it's called the glass cliff. I don't know if you've heard about that. And I think that was one of the key things, that really stayed in my mind, to say, am I about to step onto a glass cliff? But really what made me take on the role is that sense of deep connection with making a difference, that deep sense of connection in terms of just driving that purpose. And I just felt that I had something credible to offer to the people of South Africa and to this very storied organization. Because the reality is that the SABC plays a very crucial role in the South African public. And for me, it was very, when I looked at it, I thought this is the one time where I can fail spectacularly or do something so amazing that I can leave a legacy for future generations for this public institution that I do believe still has a very critical role to play in preserving South Africa's democracy.
I think that's so important for leaders coming through to be able to think about the possibility of failure and to accept that they're walking into roles when they climb up that leadership board where they will be challenged more and you have to be willing to accept failure if you're going to go and progress in those roles. So that's so refreshing. When you were looking at it, did you also have fears that you would be under-equipped to take on the role? Because although you'd had some amazing roles before in the marketing space, this was really a big step to go into a CEO role of such a large and important organization. Did you worry that there were gaps in what you were bringing to the table there?
So I did. It's very rare for marketers to become CEOs. You find that if you go the finance stream, usually you becoming a CEO is seen as a natural progression of your career. CMOs tend to stay as CMOs until we retire, unless we go and become a CMO of a marketing related industry, going, let's say, into the advertising industry and becoming a CEO of an ad agency. So definitely I recognize I don't want to call them my limitations, but the opportunities that lay in front of me from a growth perspective. But I must say, Colin, I remember one of my welcome emails was, and I won't mention the union, but it was like, you are not CEO material, because CEO material was seen as male, number one. That's another thing. So I had to deal with that gender bias that automatically came with it, because if you look at the SABC, I'm the second female CEO in the 89-year history of the SABC. So immediately, this is not expected. And of course, you're a marketer, what do you know? Not forgetting the fact that the SABC plays a massive role in the marketing industry. At the end of the day, commercially, it is all about, our communications, content, and marketing. So I did think in that nature, but I think what's important is your ability to grow, your ability to learn, your ability to self-innovate. One of the key things I always say to my team, we don't know what we don't know, but we can go out and know what we don't know. So that's one of the key things. And I think secondly, it's basically your support network that's very critical, both formal and informal. If I look at just the people that I've met who've really been amazing in empowering me with knowledge in terms of this very uncertain industry. I mean, if you think about it, the media industry is one of the most changed industries in the world. If you just think about what's happened in the last couple of years in terms of the seismic shifts that have taken place in this industry. So one of the key things that I've always been clear about is you're walking into an industry that is going through enormous changes, that has been greatly impacted. And therefore, what does it require for somebody then to lead? And this is not just any media organization. SABC happens to be one of the biggest media organizations on the African continent by virtue of having 18 radio stations, 5 TV stations, and now TV channels. And now, obviously, we have the OTT streaming platform, which is seeing enormous growth. So based on that alone, I think there is a realization that the most important thing is to surround yourself with the best people from a leadership perspective, people that you can also learn from, people you can collaborate with, and people who share a common vision with you. I think for me, that was important. It's not possible that you can learn everything, but once you can leverage off the strengths of the people you've surrounded yourself with, then you are able then to orchestrate an ecosystem that enables you to succeed.
Was that a key definitive thought process that you went through during the interview process and when they were approaching you about where you could find support, where you would find peers, and to get that sense that people in the organization would be there to help develop your knowledge in the areas which were going to be new and fresh, like it is for any new particular role, and to give you the confidence to come in and actually take the lead? Was that a key thought in the planning process? And I guess essentially takes you over the line when you get comfortable with it. This is a job that you're willing to take the risk to do.
It was a very important thought in that process. And I think, Colin, as well, from my perspective, was I had spent a couple of years at MultiChoice, and also those relationships were still very much alive. And I think, in these institutions that we go into, yes, we compete for every rand from an advertising perspective. We are competitors, but I always say we are also we cooperate, because at the end of the day, there's the industry in which we all exist in, and there's common learnings from each other. So I looked at that, but I also looked at the fact that there was also mentorship available. I've always been very much one person who actively seeks out mentors, to help guide my thinking, to help guide my development. And therefore there's the formal mentorship, and there's also that informal mentorship that I've always experienced. But I think, Colin, also what has been great for me is that I've always been in situations where I've worked with high performance teams. So one of the key things I've always had a reliance on is that it's important for you to have the right people who are mission critical in what you are trying to do. The people who really not only just buy into the vision, but who actively live the vision in their DNA. And obviously, in a lot of institutions, that also requires some sort of mindset shift in order to get to that level. So definitely, that was very important. And then I think also I had a lot of support from also female leaders, not just within the industry, but outside the industry, which was very, very important. So, and also my board, really, I realized that I had the requisite support required from them, which was critical. And also the informal people, in a role of this nature, it's not the type of thing where you just go for an interview and you get a letter of offer. A lot of background checks go on in terms of your capability, your history, whether your story checks out, etc. So you find out later, in fact, that you have a lot of advocacy that you're not even aware of. When names pop up to say, we spoke to so-and-so and this is what they had to say about you. And that was for me, it was the most humbling actually experience during this process.
So you had some perspectives about what you would be walking into, obviously, as you did your research and just generally what's being reported. And clearly in your previous roles, you've dealt with the SABC as well. You've walked in and it's the first couple of weeks, the office is set, you're starting to go and make the inquiries and learn what's really happening. What was the perception that you had versus the reality in that first month? How good or bad, and how different was it from what you expected?
So I didn't walk in with any preconceived ideas. I think it's very important for me to say that. I obviously have been in this industry, so I've had a lot of engagement with the SABC. I was a client to the SABC. So I played a very important role in terms of just utilizing their assets and growing the brands I was custodian on. So I know the organization from that perspective. But walking in and being outside is not the same thing, obviously. And I think what was important was for me to get to know the people, to get to know the structure, get to know how the SABC is made up, how the SABC has managed to survive to where it is. I came in fact, after the board had just been appointed. The new board was appointed they started in March 2023, and I came in February 2024. So what was important is that it was a time when we were actually developing our new 5-year strategy and our new corporate plan, which gave me an opportunity really to play a very important role in shaping the future of the organization and co-creating with the board and SABC employees. So for me, that was very critical. I also obviously inherited a living, breathing institution. I always say the SABC is not a startup, but I had to learn about the challenges the organization is facing, and really not just understanding the existential threat of the SABC from a regulatory, from a legal perspective, but also just in terms of the changes that have taken place, the disruption that has taken place in the media industry, and how it has impacted the SABC, and how has the SABC reacted to those changes. And I think that was very important because, there were a lot of own goals that were scored by us, where we could have been ahead of the curve on certain things. But I also believe that there were some constraints that we faced. So very importantly, it was an opportunity for me to get to know the DNA of the organization, get to know the operating model, also look at it in view of the global players, learning from what is the BBC doing? What are the key issues facing public service media organizations globally as we sit here? And what's interesting, Colin, is that I've recently joined the Public Media Task Force with a global body. And some of the challenges that we're having in South Africa are not unique to us. And so that's really what I had to learn. But I think the most critical one was, how do we ensure that the SABC is sustainable for the future, facing the existential threat that I was referring to earlier?
Do you set your timelines for thinking about strategies? And where I'm going there are some leaders come in, and there's definitely pressure in the early stages for leaders to step up and make bold decisions and show that they've arrived. And if I think across to the US, there's certainly some examples of some very bold and often crazy decisions from the techno mafia over there. I don't have to mention any names. Others come in and they're taking very different style in terms of watching brief and being, very careful before actually getting directly involved. What was your kind of strategy to help you to get ready to develop the strategy, that key part that the CEO has?
My approach was a more considered approach. I'm not a believer of leadership by slogans. I'm not that type of person. I think what was important for me was to really get to know the current reality of the organization and be realistic in terms of where it's going. But also bringing in the type of leapfrogging, the type of innovation that's going to be required. And I think one of the key things from what we have as SABC at the moment, is that we're looking at this from a horizon view, where we are saying we're looking at 3 horizons within the time frame we are in. What are the things that we can do in Horizon 1? What do we start building in Horizon 1 to ready for Horizon 2? And then what are really the game-changing activities that need to take place to take us to Horizon 3? So that was very important. But I think most importantly was to get the buy-in of both the leadership of the SABC and the employees of the SABC. Because the difference, Colin, with the public sector and the private sector is that in the private sector, your CEOs tend to stay for a very long time. If you just look at, let's say, the financial services sector, etc., you find CEOs have been there for 20 plus years. And it's the same thing that my colleague, in fact, I'll say it at eMedia said to me, he said to me, Nomsa, if you look at eMedia and you look at my exco, in terms of just a collective experience inside this organization, it's probably more than 100 years old. The difference, I think, with public institutions such as ours is that CEOs stay for shorter periods. We have a 5-year contract, and after 5 years, most of us decide to move on and try something else. And therefore, from an execution of strategy perspective, there tends not to be that longevity that is required for us to stay the course. Because a strategy, I always say that it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And if you look at just competitively in the media industry, a lot of organizations spend the first couple of years with a big ingestion of investment to build for the future. But in the situation that we are in, the expectation is always to make a profit from year one, which actually is not realistic if you start looking at just the challenges that you're facing. And the fact that you've got a limitation when it comes to an investment perspective. We don't have traditional investors like our competitors have. There's partly a dependence, a very tiny one, by the way. Only 4% of our income comes in the form of a government grant. We have to compete. 83% of our income comes in the form of commercial activities, and then 13% from TV license, from the TV license regime, which is actually meant to be what sustains the organization. But as we know, because of the evasion rate, that's not the issue. So for me, I think that is really how one has to look at it from an SABC perspective, to say that you do have this 5-year period where you really have to make an impact. And you really have to choose in terms of what's the low-hanging fruit that is going to sustain, because you have to have those short-term wins. You can't keep on saying, well, in 4 years' time, I'll show the difference. You have to have those short-term wins that coming to fruition, and that's what helps galvanize the employees to actually now to start buying into the vision, because they start seeing the real change, the impactful change that is taking place. And then obviously there's a longer term, and I think one of the things, Colin, really I believe in is that we have to plant the seeds of the tree whose shade we will never sit under, because you have to have the long-term thinking that whose strategies will only come into fruition way past you've left, Auckland Park. But the reality is that that strategic thinking, the seed that you've planted, will actually sustain the organization for the future. For me, that's really the strategic thinking, is that I've got the short term in terms of what are the quick wins that, and one of the key ones was the elections, for example. For me, it was very critical to be able to demonstrate the breadth and the strength of the SABC in delivering the information and the education to South Africans across the multiplicity of viewpoints, across the different languages, across all our platforms. And I think we did a brilliant job of showcasing that wall-to-wall coverage that only the SABC can deliver. And by the way, the SABC has the biggest newsroom on the African continent. So that's very important. So for me, that those type of wins started driving the culture in the organization, where people could start seeing that, in fact, there's relevance in this institution. And then obviously then building towards the longer term thinking. And that's just one example, for example. And then we've got obviously the midterm that we are working towards. And then the longer term thinking that, as I say, one will not be here to actually see that coming into fruition, but I will be sitting somewhere smiling as I see it happen.
Right, so there's lots of questions that I want to ask on the back of what you've just said there, especially with, well, we'll come on to that in a minute. What I want to say though is before that, girlfriend, we'll come to your question in a minute. I've got a spot there because I also want to ask that one as well. But before we continue, let's set the scene a bit now, because now that you've walked into the SABC, I mean, we've called this kind of, this moment where there's massive complexity, there's huge amounts of change. What are the big issues that you walked into at the SABC? There's things that cause you sleepless nights because they are potentially life-threatening for the organization.
Thanks, Colin, for the question, because that's very important. For me, there's three critical areas. And when I say three, it might sound, but for me, they're the most significant immediate challenges that the SAB is facing. So we have the analog switch off that is scheduled to actually take place on the 31st of March. We know that in the last couple of years, there has been an effort to move from analog, to digital transformation in South Africa. So the transition from analog to digital is something that the SABC 100% supports. But the reality is that the country is not ready for the final switch off, simply because if we look at the rollout of the set-top boxes into indigent households, the threshold that was targeted has not been reached. We are nowhere near that. So what it means is that if this analog switch off does take place, it's going to literally overnight translate into decreased audiences for the SABC, for both free-to-air broadcasters, by the way, not just for the SABC, but mostly for the SABC, because we still have about 4.5 million households who receive SABC services via analog technology. So that's important. And the minute you lose audiences, you lose revenue. Because as I said, 83% of our income comes from commercial activities. So that keeps me awake at night. The second issue is basically the outdated funding model of the SABC. The SABC, the Broadcasting Act is the Broadcasting Act of 1999. If you just think about the evolution of broadcasting of the content timeline, not just in South Africa, globally, you realize that legislation that emanates in 1999 is no longer relevant in 2025. So the limitations of that regulation is something that is really of a challenge to us. And hence, from an SABC perspective, the SABC bill, which is currently, has been withdrawn by the Minister of Communications, was very critical in basically establishing a new regime for SABC from a regulatory environment perspective. So at the moment, as we sit here, the progress of that has been stalled. And that's a big challenge for the SABC. Then the third one is really the funding model itself. I spoke earlier that when the SABC came into being, because it was then a state broadcaster, and let's call it what it was. And then obviously post 94, it became a true public broadcaster. Funding model actually never changed. The funding model for the SABC, the belief was that the SABC would collect TV licenses that would fund the public mandate of the SABC, which is a massive cost to the SABC. However, that funding model never worked because really more than 80% of South Africans who own TVs don't pay for TV licenses. It's actually something that people are very proud of not doing. So the reality that then it meant that the funding model had to change. You know what's interesting, Colin, I mean, you're based in the UK. The BBC themselves are struggling with this funding model. And the difference is that, in fact, the BBC currently has more adherence to paying for a TV license. But they've also noticed that with the new audiences, is that the manner in which content is being consumed, this funding model is totally outdated. I have 2 young children who were born in a digital world. They're digital natives. They've never really been part of the culture or the ritual of appointment viewing. They've never been there. I grew up knowing that at 7 o'clock, it was the Zulu news, and then my parents and I would sit, and my siblings would sit around the table, around the chair, the sofas watching. But the difference is that the new audience we're talking to decides when their prime time is going to be. So when you have a funding model that's based on a Broadcasting Act of 1999, that's based on a certain behavior of a consumer, you start realizing how outdated it is, especially in a situation where in the last couple of years, not only have we had new entrants like pay TV in our market, but what has also happened is that we've had the influx of digital platforms that have entered the South African market, driven by obviously the growth of internet penetration and the penetration of smartphones. And based on that alone, I have many instances where I talk to people about, whether they watch SABC or not. And they will say to me, of course, I don't watch SABC, but I watch Skim Sam on digital, on my phone. Hello, that is SABC. So that is basically the change of the thinking that has taken place. And that's really what's keeping me awake. So that funding model, what it's done is that it's really constrained SABC's ability to invest ahead of the curve so that we can drive our Horizon 3 thinking and invest in digital transformation and the technology that is required for us to remain relevant in a very changed environment. So those are really the 3 things that are keeping me awake. It's that analog switch off that is scheduled to take place in 2 weeks' time. It's the funding model that is still not that is still outstanding, and obviously it's the SABC bill that is supposed to replace that old 1999 Broadcast Act.
All right, I'll ask one more question, and hopefully the siren in the background isn't coming through and annoying all of you guys. I am in London, but I actually am based in Cape Town most of the time. So I'll ask my question. You've mentioned Horizon 3 again. I'm sure people on the call have heard of Horizon 1, 2, and 3 and the work that McKinsey did in bringing this kind of strategy framework. If anyone's got a link, do put it on the chat so that anyone that hasn't heard of that can quickly read up on it. What I want to know before going into the questions we've got on the chat is how you manage those different stakeholder opinions, because these are big issues to go and resolve. If you want to have more power, for example, over your revenue model, or if you want to be able to go and reset when certain programs are playing, so it doesn't have to be we're going to have this local language program at this particular time, we're having this topic or format at this particular time, those are significant. And I would imagine a lot of your stakeholders disagree or have different opinions about what the solution should be. What tactics do you use to try to bring all these different stakeholders together?
So SABC has, SABC shareholder is actually the Minister of Telecom of Communications and Digital Technologies. So that's our direct reporting line. And in that, we have quite a lot of other stakeholders, which includes, whether it's lobby groups, whether it's Parliament itself, and the citizenry of South Africa who have a vested interest in this institution, because at the end of the day, it belongs to them. We are also governed by quite a lot of regulatory. So if you look at our licensing conditions, are governed by ICASA, so we have quite a lot of stakeholder groupings that we engage with, and that's also the importance, I suppose, of also having a board that has an understanding of then how do we orchestrate, for the SABC to ensure that our requirements are front and center, not just from a government perspective, but including, let's say, in the private sector. Like I said, we compete very much so with private sector organizations. So how do we manage those stakeholder groups? Colin, I think if I had 100% answer to that, I would write a book and I'd make a lot of money out of it, because that is the key question. But I think what's important is always to be very clear about what your vision and your mission is. And I think that clarity and the consistency of messaging in every place that you go and you get the opportunity to engage key decision makers is very important. It can't be that on a different conversation, your stance is different. So that consistency for me, it's very, very important. I think also the key knowledge for us of knowing what needs to be done in order to progress the SABC is very important. So one of the key things that we are doing is really going to critical stakeholders and using them in advocacy for the SABC. What's important is that there's always been a belief that, for example, the SABC is asking for a bailout. And we are saying, actually, that is not the language for us. The SABC is simply asking for government to fund the public mandate. Currently, the SABC is divided into two sets. We've got the public service mandate and we've got the commercial side of the SABC. The commercial activities of the SABC are funding the SABC public mandate. If the SABC public mandate was being funded, I wouldn't be having the financial existential threat that I'm having. So I think what's important then is to make our key stakeholders have a common understanding of what is it going to take to make the SABC successful for the future, and what has happened in the environment in which it exists. Why do we require a change in regulation? And then get those stakeholders then to be able to represent us in the rooms that we are not in, because now they're empowered to be able then to speak to the SABC requirements from a more informed and meaningful position. So for me, I think that's the most important part from a stakeholder perspective, but it's also developing those relationships, developing partnerships. One of the key things that we've looked at in terms of how we are innovating is also looking at how, for example, if you look, one of our key investment areas is content. And one of the most important things in South Africa that has happened that is quite beautiful when you start looking at how South Africa is really transformed from a national identity perspective. The most contested space is actually local content. South Africans love local content. If I'd spoken to you 20 years ago, it was the opposite. But it's beautiful to have watched the journey that we've traversed as South Africans and how local content has become so relevant in our lives. And we are looking at different ways in terms of how do you then acquire content, and it has become a very expensive exercise, because we are not just competing as South African organizations, but we are competing with global OTT streaming platforms that are based in South Africa. So you start building those different relationships in terms of technological exchanges that need to take place. We are playing a very important role when it comes to the BRICS formation. I've spent quite a lot of, some time with my colleagues from China, etc., saying, how do we leverage off their technology, prowess when it comes to broadcasting? So it's building those global relationships, but also local relationships, and ensuring that you've got those stakeholder groupings that understand, your strategy and your vision, and are able to advocate on your behalf as well.
Wonderful. So there's so many takeaways in there: transparency, purpose, consistency, advocacy. Absolutely love that. I've got to do the questions now, otherwise I'll be accused of lying and promising things that I don't live up to. So Gelfan's question: did the political interference that is often associated with the SABC not dissuade you in any way, shape, or form?
I obviously that played a massive role in terms of when I was making a decision on whether this was the right opportunity for me or not. But I think also what's important is the SABC will always be a contested space, irrespective of which government is in power on the day. It will always be a contested space, simply because of the reach and the scale of the SABC. The SABC on a daily basis has more than 27 million South Africans who come in to listen to our radio stations, who come in to watch our content, who come in to listen to the news. So that obviously was something that I had to grapple with. But importantly, there's governance that exists. So if you think about the news, we always say we are independent and we are impartial. And this is something that we really stick by, because we believe that one of the key things we have to ensure that we don't erode the trust that is placed on the SABC as a source of news, for example. So definitely it is a contested space. It has many stakeholders. If you just listen to SAFM on your way to work, you realize that it's not just the political actors that have an interest in SABC, but it's South Africans like you and me who have a vested interest in the SABC, and therefore we have to ensure that we are representative of that, and we are not seen to be playing into, any undue influence. And so for me, that's something that's very important, and that's part of the legacy that I'd like to leave in terms of just the fact that editorial independence is sacrosanct in ensuring that our newsroom still remains the same newsroom that delivered, the elections.
Well, a yes or no answer. Have you ever been pressured by politicians to present news which is no longer impartial?
No, I haven't.
I think
I
that's very
haven't. I think there's always a debate. There's always a debate. There's always different perspectives. And one is always listening to the different perspectives. And the final decision at the end of the day sits with the newsroom. So what's interesting is that the CEO of the SABC also does not influence the news. I think that it's important for me to say that, because I can also have a viewpoint, but at the end of the day, editorial decisions sit with the newsroom. They do not sit with the head of the SABC whatsoever. My interest in the newsroom is the commercial aspects, the people aspects, but editorially, the SABC charter is very clear on that. So we can debate, there's different perspectives, but that still sits squarely in the shoulders of the newsroom.
Next questions from Sipiwe. We have to ask this one because this is a Henley sponsored event, and you have an MBA from Henley. How has that helped you navigate your leadership journey? I'm just going to leave the question there. I think that's the important part.
It's been very critical for me. At the Henley MBA, I think for me, what the important part of it is a real lived experience, because you are able to learn and apply. That was important. So a lot of the time, Colin, there's the academic and then there's the practice. And for me, the Henley MBA, I was able to translate it from the academic to the practice, and it's really been very critical for me. And I think I remember I was in that cohort when Henley introduced business in Africa, and for me, just that type of innovation in the offering was very important. So I took that module, and it really opened up my eyes to the possibility that is the African continent. And so when I talk to SABC and I talk about the biggest newsroom on the African continent, it's because of the realization as well about how important the rest of the continent is in terms of growth for this institution. If you think about the fact that we are the youngest continent in the world, and we are really the future growth frontier for a lot of organizations. And then how do we, as South Africans, leverage that for ourselves?
How do you measure if the strategies you've implemented either here, but let's stick to the SABC experiences. How do you measure whether you're kind of winning and making progress on these at the moment? And I really like the question because, as you said earlier, a lot of the things you're trying to do have got a very long-term perspective, and that's often difficult to actually sit down and say there's an obvious KPI that you can show that you're making progress, on these things.
Obvious KPIs. We've got an entire planning cycle from a public sector perspective, obviously driven by the department, and also oversight coming from the portfolio committee on communications. So there is the KPIs that you have to deliver literally on a quarterly basis that translate to your annual targets. And one of the key things is financial performance. I think that is something for any organization. You can tell whether you're performing financially or not. I think there is more long-term investment that takes place. But we do have, the measures that we look into. One of the key ones is audience share. This is something that we guard jealously. This is something that we track. This is something that we utilize as a currency to go to market and be able then to translate into revenue for SABC. So there are very much longer term ambitions. And one of the key ones, the exciting one, Colin, that we are watching its growth and is growing phenomenally, is really our OTT streaming platform, which is the SABC Plus. As I sit here today, our target for the end of March was 500,000 users on SABC Plus. We have breached 800, at the end of March 2025, we've breached 850,000 users. So we definitely track our performance. We track our dashboards. We are very clear in terms of what our short-term wins are, our medium-term wins are. So yes, there are, and then also, the rate of transformation that is taking place, how do we replicate? And then also, how do we grow our people? Because that's very important, because we need to ensure that we've got the right people at the right place at the right time to be able to deliver on the strategy. Because if you don't have that capacity to be able to deliver that, then you won't be able to realize the ambitions that you've got.
Is it lonely at the top?
Can be very lonely. And it's key. One of my former colleagues, Itumeleng at MTN, actually raised that with me, and she said to me, be very careful, it can be extremely lonely, and therefore it's important for you to really tap into your network to ensure that you don't feel that loneliness. So the reality is that that you are the face of the success and the face of the failure. So that in itself brings a certain level of loneliness. But I think there are times, Colin, I always say to myself, a winner has many parents, a loser has many, is an orphan, So one has to really try and navigate it, that you do then utilize your support structure. And I must say, I've got a great support structure. I've got, colleagues that in my career in marketing, we started together as marketing coordinators, and we sit where we are. And we're a strong group of people who really support each other. I've got my family who has really been there when I've had to make some serious sacrifices, who've picked up a lot of flack for me in helping to raise my children, for example. So what am I saying? I'm saying that it can be lonely, but you have to watch out and ensure that you don't make it lonely. You have to ensure that you really leverage that ecosystem that surrounds you. You've got to have, look at that support system and ensure that you don't find yourself isolated and being lonely, because I think when that happens, it can actually impact your ability to make the right decisions.
Yeah, and I asked that as a segue into Nasir's question because I think it's a wonderful question. How do you sustain and maintain your energy levels? This complex environment, stressful environment, sometimes a lonely environment. Um, what's your tactic to try to make sure that, you don't get too depressed too often, that you remain resilient? I've never met a CEO that doesn't have to put a lot of focus into that because of the pressure of the job.
I'm going to say something simple. You need to have a sense of humor. You need to have that ability to laugh at yourself and to laugh with others, because everything can be so serious most of the time. So yes, there's the Harvard Business School, building resilience, etc. But I think for me, you really have to have a sense of humor. You really have to have, I think, that EQ that keeps that momentum, that keeps that energy up. For me, that's very important.
There's a lot of questions that are rolling in now. Um, let's just, and we've only got a few minutes left. Oh dear, I've probably left it. Never mind. So I should have done it for 90 minutes. Let's try to bring in something which kind of may be related to some of these questions as well. Um, what do you see as the future for SABC? You've inferred that there has to be change. You've indicated that there are lots of competitive forces out there talking about how people consume
Mm,
entertainment,
mm.
nowadays. When you're looking forward over the next 4, 5, 6 years, what are you hoping that SABC is going to be able to pivot towards in terms of offering differentiated entertainment?
So I I think, SABC obviously, let me go back to talk to the current. So if I look at it, I look at the strength that SABC has in radio with the 18 radio stations. I think there's a great opportunity for the SABC to strengthen the revenue share from the radio perspective. SABC has 70% market share for radio, but around 35%. We've grown in the last year from 30% revenue share to around 35%. I see a great opportunity for us to increase and grow when it comes to radio. When television came into being, around, was it 1979? People already saw the death of radio. It never happened. In fact, radio is strengthening. So I see that. I see the SABC really transforming into a multi-platform media environment where it's no longer just seen as a linear television with 5 channels. I think the opportunity that's being presented to us by the analog switch off is that the SABC has no choice but to pivot into ensuring that it has a direct to home platform. So that's one of the key things that needs to happen. And what does that mean? Immediately, the SABC is no longer a 3 to 5 channel player. It now all of a sudden has far more channels and far more inventory to take to market and grow. So for me, that's very important. I think there's an opportunity that is gold that has always been lying at the SABC. And those are our archives. I said earlier that SABC is the greatest archivist of South Africa's history. We are in the process at the moment of digitizing those archives, and we will be we are developing the a revenue stream where we will be licensing the archives, but also going back and looking at some of our content and looking at the remakes, obviously in partnership with other producers, etc. So for me, there's a great opportunity for the SABC from that perspective. But I think there's an opportunity for it to also play a bigger role from a user-generated content perspective. If the SABC is to stay relevant, if you look at the younger audiences, it needs to ensure that it offers solutions for the younger audience and not just sees itself as a public institution. So I think what I'm saying is that I see it as a bigger player. And I saw a question coming up, for example, talking about the PSL, which is sport. The minute the SABC has its own DTH platform, it means that it has more capacity, for example, to have more content. So currently we sit in a situation where even if we had the financial muscle to buy any content we wanted to buy in the world, we just don't have the capacity to flight it because we have a limitation of channels. But the minute we bring that DTH solution, we into place, all of a sudden we don't have that limitation of channels. So it changes the face of the institution, and it gives us new revenue streams that we can play into. So for me, I think that's very important. But I think also in a world, Colin, of misinformation and disinformation, the future of the SABC still lies very importantly in its role as serving communities when it comes to news. I do believe that we can still strengthen the position of news. I see SABC growing onto the African continent. I really see it growing. 4 of the biggest radio stations in Africa are SABC. The top 4 actually are SABC radio stations. And I see that growth into the African continent taking place. And I also see us leveraging, for example, BRICS partnerships where SABC starts having a presence in other markets, not just within South Africa itself. So it's quite a big ambition that one has. But when you start looking at just the influx of digital platforms on the African continent, it's time for Africa to export itself to other markets. We can't just be the receivers of innovation. We also have to be the exporters of innovation. And I think the SABC can play a massive role working in partnership with local players, when I was talking about co-opetition and collaboration, to ensure that it still plays a massive role in the content industry on the African continent.
So we've just got 3 minutes left. I've just promoted Barry Van Zyl up onto the panel. I don't know if you remember Barry. He may have been one of your instructors at Henley. And for those that don't know Barry, how can you not know Barry? The drummer for Johnny Clegg. But the reason I wanted to bring Barry up was because he's had a relationship with SABC for years and years during his career. And I just wanted to ask you, Barry, what your view of the importance of SABC actually is.
Hi there, Colin. Well, thanks for promoting me, firstly, and Nomsa, thank you so much for your time. And I've just loved everything you've said, especially this last few minutes about your big audacious goal for exporting African creativity. That speaks to my heart straight away. Colin, to your point, I spent a lot of time at the SABC studios from the early to mid 90s. Both audio and TV, mostly Auckland Park. And that was between my studies in the US and then later as a session musician in Johannesburg. I played on tons of albums in the SABC studios for people like Paul Hamner, Johnny Ferree, McCoy and Kobata, Johnny Clegg, and many more. In fact, I saw Vic Masondo, he's on this call, and he would have been one of my colleagues that worked in the studios together over that time. So Vic, good to see you. Good to see your name. To Nomsa's point, all of the material is sitting in the SABC archives. And in my opinion, it's an absolute treasure trove, just thousands and thousands of hours of recordings that capture the South African music. It's a cultural repository of South African music. And I guess the big question now is to how to balance making money from it while keeping it as an accessible resource for the public. Yes, I did tons of stuff. I played on television shows, live jazz sessions, musical reviews, talk shows, all kinds of things. In fact, I was part of Jonas Gwangwa's house band for Dali Tambo's very first talk show in the mid-90s. And we recorded it at Auckland Park, which at the time still very much carried the weight of its history. And the first episode was pretty historic because we had Madiba, we had Nelson Mandela as the first guest, and Mick Hucknall from Simply Red was the musical guest. And there we were recording in a space that had once served a very different purpose. And what I was witnessing, I realized in reflection, was a powerful shift in leadership and in storytelling and in, I guess, national identity. So in a very real way, I experienced that transition from within the SABC, and I experienced it through the lens of a drummer. And so that's why today's conversation is so meaningful for me. The role of a broadcaster, I think, isn't just about content. It's about culture and history and change. And Nomsa, as the CEO leading the SABC, She's leading it through another critical transformation as we speak. And so from Henley's point of view, Nomsa, we wish you well with it's a complex challenge. But if I dare say, as one of our MBA graduates, you're very well prepared, as you've just alluded to. Could I close with a question for Nomsa, Colin?
It's going to have to be a yes or no question because it's kind of we're at the 1 o'clock. We've hit the hour.
Okay, I'm going to answer the. I'm going to ask the question and leave it for further reflection on another call. How about that?
Go for it.
So I was thinking, while the conversation was going, you know, with everything, the backdrop, the context that Nomsa has so well articulated, as well as the backdrop of, I guess, media companies now using AI to personalize content, attract viewers, stay competitive. The other backdrop, I guess, is that globally trust in news is falling. So against that backdrop, I'd say, Nomsa, you're an expert in marketing and growth. If the SABC were a startup today, what would be your top 3 moves to grow your audience?
So I love the question. Thank you very much.
A big question. It can't be answered in 30 seconds.
No.
I'm not going to even allow you to try to answer that question. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to beg that we send that question over to you via email, Nomsa, and beg you to just go and give me a reply. And if you do, then I'll share it back on the mailer for everyone that's logged into this call so that they're not left hungry for that particular one. But with that, unfortunately, we've run out of time. I should have brought in Barry a lot earlier. I should have tried to get the audience questions a lot earlier. There's so many things I've done wrong. I'll do better next time. But with that, Nomsa, thank you very much for joining us. It was an absolute pleasure to be able to interview. I feel inspired at the end of this discussion. I can see from the comments on the chat, there's many other people that do so too. I hope we'll get a chance to interview again in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Barry. And thank you to everyone who joined us here today. I'm inspired. Thank you.
Me too. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.